Well, good evening. Tony is not going to join us again this week. He is off with the twins. They're still in the NICU unit at the hospital, so do be praying for Parker and Scout. But I'll be with you to talk about our sermon this week, our message. Mark chapter 1, verse 40 through 45 is the primary text, and it's a miracle story, one of many in the Gospels. It says this: a man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, talking about Jesus, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Now, I do want to make just a little note here. Jesus was indignant. There's a textual variant here, and so some translations will say Jesus felt compassion. So there is a variety when it comes to the actual, there's just a textual variant there. So indignant, I think, is the correct one. Anyway, he reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places, yet the people still came to him from everywhere. So when we look at this particular miracle story where Jesus heals a leper, I want to dig into leprosy for just a moment. Leprosy in ancient times, in biblical times, really represented a whole kind of family of skin diseases. Now, leprosy, kind of the main one, is Hansen's, and that's one that we talk about today. It's very uncommon in the West, but it still does exist in other places, and it really is pretty brutal as a disease. I read a book about pain by Dr. Paul Brand, and one of the ways that it really hurts people is that the person with that disease doesn't have pain. And so what happens is you just destroy your body. So like, for instance, if you or I reached out and grabbed the handle of a pan and it was hot, we immediately would pull back because we would experience pain. But the person with leprosy does not. And so they just pick it up and grab it, and they scorch their hand, and there's no pain to tell them to stop. And so they end up just really damaging their extremities, and they often go blind because, they forget to blink. We blink because our eye starts to dry out and we experience pain. And so Dr. Paul Brand talked about how they would have lepers chew gum a lot and try to get them to blink every so often, based off the chewing of gum. And so it's just kind of an interesting difficulty that people experience. To be a leper was a terrible situation. You literally had to yell everywhere you went, "Unclean, unclean." You were ceremonially unclean. People were frightened of you. They were scared that they were going to get it. You were supposed to stay about 6 feet away from anyone. And so it was a really isolating and difficult thing. The only thing we kind of had in our culture, some of you will remember this, back in the early days of AIDS, there was a stigma and there was real fear, like, how do we get AIDS and what's happening? And that has a little bit of a visualization of what it was like to be an ancient leper. One example, a story I was reading that Philip Yancey shares, was an AIDS patient, and he went to see his family, hadn't seen them in 7 years, traveled 1,100 miles for Thanksgiving, and he goes, and they welcomed him, but they were very scared because people didn't know how AIDS was transferred at that point. And so everyone got, their turkey dinner, and he got his, but everyone else was on the fine china, and he was on paper plates with plastic utensils because they were afraid to give him something that they would use later, even after washing. And so just a very isolating kind of disease. And so There is some instances of healing of leprosy in the Bible. Miriam, the sister of Moses, was healed of leprosy. We also see Naaman in the Old Testament, who was a pagan general who came, and Elijah, God used to heal him of leprosy. So we do see this. In the Old Testament, it is prophesied that the Messiah would do some healings, specifically opening the eyes of the blind, helping the deaf to hear, those kinds of things. I don't think leprosy was specifically mentioned in Old Testament prophecy, but that ministry of healing was mentioned. So when I look at this particular passage, I see the problem of leprosy, and many theologians kind of point to that as a problem of sin because it's deep, it's isolating, it causes so many problems. I also see in this text a powerful prayer. In Mark 1:40 of our text again, he came to him, begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." So it's a very simple prayer. It's very earnest. It's also very reverent. Notice he gets on his knees before Jesus. Notice it's very humble. He doesn't demand, a healing. He says, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." He believes. He believes Jesus can do it. If you're willing, you can do this. You can do it. Very specific about what he wants. Not just bless me, not just help me, but very specific. And so I think there's some lessons about prayer in this passage. I also love what really grabs me in this passage is the sacred touch. It's really kind of stands out if you read it. Mark 1 verse 41, we see Jesus was indignant, so he's upset about what this disease has done to him. Because remember, sin entered the world, and part of that fallout from sin entering the world is disease and death. And so Jesus is upset about that and what ultimately sin led to, all the damage it has done. So Jesus is indignant, and then notice, and here's the line that grabs me in this passage. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "and be clean." So he reaches out and touches the untouchable. He touches a man who had to run around and say, "Unclean, unclean," who people were frightened of. It was interesting. Dr. Paul Brand was working with a leprosy patient, and he reached out and touched the man on his shoulder as he was talking to him. And, he was using a translator. The man spoke Tamil. This was in India. And the man just began to sob. And Dr. Paul Brand said to the translator, "Did I say something wrong? Did I do something wrong?" And the translator had a conversation with the man, and he simply said this. He said, "When you put your hand on my shoulder," he said, "until I came here, no one had touched me for many, many years." And so this probably how that leper felt, that Jesus reached out and touched him and cleansed him. He could have done it with just a word. He didn't have to touch him, but he reached out and touched him. I think it's part of the care and the beauty of how Jesus wants to heal us at all kinds of levels. Now, also, I want you to see in this text, there's a test given and a failure of that test. And so the test given was, he told the man that he healed, "Don't go tell people." What does the man do? He runs out and tells everybody. And so that test of obedience, the man failed big time. And it caused a real problem for Jesus. He couldn't go into a town now because everyone wanted a miracle. Everyone wanted a healing. And so he had to stay out in desert places, away from towns, and the crowds still were following him. So he was trying to control the crowds, and this guy really messed it up for him. So as I look at this particular passage, and I look at the different lessons that are in there, I think I would sum up with simply that Jesus offers us healing. And you could really unpack that and dig into that. Healing from our sin, healing from our broken relationship with God. Sometimes he steps in with physical healing. And I do appreciate a song out right now called Joy in the Morning. I believe it's Elevation Worship. And they say this, if it's not done, if it's not good, then he's not done with it yet. And it's the idea that God is still working. And when we go through trials and difficulties, God is still working. Now, sometimes the final answer is not till heaven, but he does work things out for his people. Now, a couple questions. Two questions for me that I want to get into very quickly. One is, why does it seem to many people, I got asked this at our Questioning Christianity event at the Fort Wainwright just recently. Why does it seem to many people that we don't see as many miracles today as we do in the Bible? And one thing to say on this is to remember that, say, for instance, the book of Acts is a Cliff Note version. It's a highlight reel of the first 30 years of the church. And so you're going to just see the high moments. So you don't want to compare a highlight reel with kind of the backstage life that we're all living. And so that's one of the reasons. One of the other reasons is sometimes we don't notice that that not everybody gets a miracle. That's in the scripture as well. We see the Apostle Paul, one of his companions, Epaphroditus, was sick almost to the point of death. Now, he didn't die, but he really got sick, and it wasn't just a quick, instant thing. We see that Timothy was encouraged by Paul to drink a little wine for his ongoing stomach problems. Paul didn't just step in and heal that. We also see another time Erastus, who remained in Corinth, and it says that Paul left him sick there. And so Paul didn't perform a miracle. So to think that every sick person all the time was always healed in biblical times is not accurate, even though sometimes we can get that impression. So I think there are lots of miracles today. It was kind of funny at the Fort Wainwright event. I'm sitting there, and here at Journey we had this miracle where our mortgage was paid off. A $1.7 million check was given. And they're asking me, and hey, we don't see miracles. And I'm sitting on a miracle, but I hadn't told the church yet. So on Friday, I couldn't share that one with them. I had to share a different story. And I'm like, well, Sunday, I'll get to share one. But it's kind of interesting. Now, another question that I want to just dig in a little bit. How could God actually use a permanent disability for his glory? If you know who Johnny Erickson Tada, she broke her neck, and God has used her from a wheelchair for the last 50 years, and she has had a profound ministry among the disabled, and she looks forward to the ultimate healing that will be offered to her in the new heavens and new earth, where she gets a new resurrection body. But God has used her not just in spite of her disability, but through her disability. Another one is Nick Vujicic, who is a great speaker, evangelist. He was born with no arms and no legs, and yet he has traveled the world, shared the gospel with so many people. Once again, God has used him not despite his disability, but through his disability. And so sometimes that is the plan. And as tough and as difficult as that might sound, that is true. So here's some questions for you to discuss. One is, what is an urgent prayer request in your life? Two is, where has Jesus offered you some type of healing in your life? Three is, where have you seen someone else experience some form of healing from God? Four is, can you think of a time when you faced a test of obedience that you are willing to share? And five, what have been some consequences when you see someone fail a test of obedience? So I encourage you to think about some of those questions, maybe the two that I dug into, and also those 5 questions I'm giving you. And then if you want to prepare for next week, we're going to talk about Mark chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. See you later.